Welcome to the Museum of the Welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I am Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. The virtual program took the month of July off due to the museum gala, but the program series is back, relaxed, tanned, and ready for another year of fun and educational programs. Fans of this museum will well remember the exhibit, The Chinese and the Iron Road, Building of the Transcontinental Railroad. In that exhibit, the museums told the story of the Chinese laborers that helped to build the Transcontinental, where they came from, and what happened to them after the railroad was completed. We traced some of those workers through the San Ramon Valley. Today, author and historian John McCormick will share the story of the Chinese impact in the development of the Napa Valley and how their work in the grape fields, hop farms, and laundries gave us the Napa that we know today. This despite the anti-Chinese leagues and discrimination that hastened the decline of what were once vibrant Chinese neighborhoods and towns. John McCormick grew up in Napa and attended local schools before earning his bachelor's degree in engineering from Cal and then his master's degree from Harper. He had a career in technology before retiring to focus on his community and his love of history. John and his wife, Colleen, own La Miranda Music in Lafayette. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome in John McCormick. John?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate the chance to speak to everybody, and it's very, very exciting that we're having a chance to really learn about and understand this this event and this topic that is just not that well known. So before I start, just a brief thing about why am I? I grew up in Napa. I currently live in Lafayette with my wife and family. Why am I telling this story? And briefly, as Dan mentioned, I got my master's degree in history from Harvard, and actually this was a few years ago as a kind of a bucket list thing I wanted to do. And one of the classes I took during the master's program was a class on the history of the U.S.-China relations, which I didn't know that much about. And during the class, we had to write a paper, as one does. We had to write several papers. But this one, I thought, let me get a little local angle. And so I just happened to Google, were there ever any Chinese in the Napa Valley where I grew up? And there was one page on one website, on the St. Helena Historical Society website, talking about Chinese who were working the vineyards in the Napa Valley in the late 1800s. And I thought, well, this is not correct. I mean, I grew up in Napa schools. We were taught, local history as one is done in the 3rd and 4th grade. And it was pretty much, the Native Americans, then the missions, and then George C. Yount and the Europeans coming in and planting all the grapes. And the Chinese were not mentioned at all. And so I started digging into it, and it was just this amazing story of this group of people, these Chinese laborers that were really the backbone and the foundation for the modern Napa Valley. And it was completely whitewashed, not mentioned in schools. There wasn't a single monument, a single anything kind of acknowledging or talking about their contribution. And so I ended up writing a paper and then decided to do my thesis on this topic. And it was just, as you peel back the onion, it's just this incredibly interesting and really inspirational story. And during that time, this was during the COVID lockdowns, there was this rise, as we all saw, of kind of anti-Asian hate. And that was kind of springing up around the Bay Area and the country. And I, like many of you, were just really felt powerless to do anything about it and really disgusted with the whole thing. And I realized, well, there's something I can do. I can actually tell this story and talk about how really Chinese were part of America and part of the story and the Napa Valley, which is a world-renowned destination. And so I ended up taking the thesis and then actually putting it into a book, which you see there, and which was released January of this year. And it's been going very well. So that's the reason I am here talking to you about this particular topic. It's very, very it's interesting, and I think deserves to be heard. So let's get into it. So we all know, presumably most of you know, about the Napa Valley today, almost 500 wineries, 4 million people visit there a year almost, and an economic output just in Napa Valley of, $12 billion a year, right? So this is just an economic powerhouse. Now, the wine industry itself began around 1870, and between 1870 and 1900, almost all of the vineyard workers, the miners, the tannery workers, the laundry workers, domestic servants were Chinese laborers. But by 1900 or so, they were almost completely gone. And they have been displaced by Italian immigrants and some other immigrant groups that kind of took up this mantle as kind of the main labor force in the valley. And as I mentioned, right now we have though this is getting better, have certainly been no acknowledgments of their contributions. So now, as we think about the Napa Valley, most of us, if we think about it all, we'll think about it kind of as is on the left, right, which is the kind of the wine map, where you can go up valley from Napa through Yountville and St. Helena and Calistoga to the different regions, which have different kinds of grapes, which makes different kinds of wines, and that we all love. I want us to think, though, about the map on the right. And the map on the right is a map from the 1890s or so, Napa Valley, and many of the towns are recognizable. There's Napa, Yountville, Oakville, Rutherford, St. Helena, Calistoga, but the spine kind of linking those together was the Napa Valley Railroad. In addition, of course, to stagecoaches and so on that would connect people. And if you look above Calistoga to the right there, you can see Mount St. Helena and the Calistoga mines. And this is the area that we will be in when we think about the Chinese and their contributions. Now, one of the reasons why it was so, I think, easy to ignore this history was that we actually have no written records from the Chinese themselves from this era. And so it made it easy to kind of ignore their contributions. And there's a couple of different reasons for it. I mean, there were certainly a lot of the poor. Most of these were farmers that came over from China to work in the United States, were illiterate. And certainly didn't, and then if they were literate, it was, Chinese, not English. And for whatever reason, we really have no written records from the workers themselves. We do have, though, an incredible amount of contemporaneous accounts, specifically from newspapers. And there were if you look today, the newspapers are still there: the St. Helena Star, the Daily Calistogan, the Napa Valley Register, plus monthly and weekly news magazines and some books that were written at the same time that talk a lot about the Chinese and what they were doing. And one of the challenges with this particular project is that the newspapers, almost without fault, were intensely anti-Chinese. They really hated the Chinese in their midst. They thought they were taking the jobs away from the white laborers, which, of course, there was such a labor shortage that wasn't the issue, and so on. So as we're going through this, we have to really read a lot of these primary sources for us, but with a very skeptical eye, and try to get the general trends. Luckily, we do have some oral histories that have been passed down from families and so on, so we can really piece together, I think, a relatively comprehensive picture. So now I know you got the group that you guys have learned a lot about Chinese and with the railroad and all that coming in there, and why they came to California, starting to work on the railroads, and that same trend then extends to agriculture. So why were Chinese in Napa at all? Well, California, obviously, from the gold rush onward, was in a perpetual state of labor shortage, right? There just weren't enough workers to do all the things that they needed to be done. And Chinese were one of the many groups that kind of came in. First, they came in for the gold rush, just like people from all over the world, really, to kind of strike it rich. But they were also recruited to come in to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, and then come in to work on the next big thing, especially once the railroad was complete in 1869, which was agriculture, right? Agriculture was big business. It's big business now. It was big business then. But California had challenges with the agribusiness, right? The land was very expensive. I know it's not a surprise to any of us, but it was expensive back then for farmland. Access to capital was expensive. The big banks and sources were in the East Coast and in Europe. Transportation was expensive. Well, I mean, we had the railroad, but it was still expensive to ship the grain and other things that you were making. And it was difficult to market your products. And of course, a lot of the agriculture had large labor requirements. And the one thing that these landowners and big farmers could control was labor cost. And so they looked for the cheapest source labor, which in almost all cases were the Chinese. The Chinese were, a lot of discrimination against them. They weren't allowed to work in a lot of different industries. Agriculture was one of the few places they could work, and they knew they could afford to pay them less. Now, in the Napa Valley in particular, the pivotal decade were the 1870s. So there was some initial beginnings of the wine industry, or kind of the early pioneers realizing that the climate and the soil of the Napa Valley was conducive to wine growing. And in the 1860s, when we had the Civil War raging, of course, mostly on the East Coast, but really did encompass the entire country, the transit and imports from the East Coast were disrupted. And so the local wineries and local experimentation had a little bit of a protection that they can kind of experiment and get this local wine going without a lot of competition from other places. Then in 1878, which is really the pivotal year, you had this, because a lot of the wine, most of the wine came from Europe, you had this blight, this insect called phylloxera, which decimated the vineyards of France. And so France, which was the main wine producer, couldn't produce wine. The local wineries, which were somewhat established by 1878 in Napa Valley, said, oh, this is our time. We're going to go for it. And they went on this giant planting spree and planted vineyards all over Napa Valley. But of course, with the rise of vineyards, you need, well, where are the laborers? They're going to work the vineyards. And that's where, of course, the demand for labor, especially Chinese labor, became quite intense. Now, the Chinese that came over, that arrived for either to work, mine gold, to work on the railroads or to agriculture, faced multiple layers of discrimination. Now, at the national level, the biggest one, and the one that's most notorious, really, in the kind of history of U.S. immigration law, is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So this was an act passed by Congress that said that no Chinese laborers could come into the United States. And this was the first immigration law passed that actually identified a group by their race. So it actually said no more Chinese laborers coming in 1882. So this was the national level. The state was even more anti-Chinese, and actually in 1880 had passed a new constitution that had like 26, I think, or 27 articles. But one article, Article 19, was dedicated, entitled Chinese. And it actually talked about how Chinese were this moral kind of the scourge, and they need to be prohibited from working in California corporations, from owning land, from voting or whatever, and were really just second-class citizens. Now, at the local level, at least at the Napa, Calistoga, and St. Helena, there was a lot of discrimination as well. And they were not any, I don't think better or worse than other parts of California, but there were anti-Chinese leagues that sprouted up. As I mentioned, the local newspapers were very anti-Chinese, and citizens there's a lot of complaining that they took jobs away from laborers, and they sent their money that they made out town. Because the reason a lot of the Chinese came over was to make money to send back to their families in China. Many of the same issues that we hear today. But the Chinese were incredibly, I think, successful and prolific, and really had an incredible amount of contributions and different kinds of contributions throughout Napa Valley. So what we can get is that we can look at the census and get some idea. Now, the census, we have to read everything with a grain of salt, and census especially so. Even today, as we all know, with census counts, minority groups can be underrepresented, right? And lower economic populations can be underrepresented. Certainly no different in the 1880s as it is today. So we can see we had, from the census count, we had no more than 1,000 Chinese at one time. It was probably more than that, but at the moment, all we have is 1,000, more than 1,000 Chinese. And unfortunately, none of that information has been digitized. So we had to go through all the census records for the county for those years and kind of just tally up manually, because in addition to their place of origin, we also get to know people's occupation. And so we can actually see all the people that were born in China and what they were doing. And it's this incredible mass of different kinds of occupations that they were doing in 1880. Now, the biggest categories of laborer, and of course, that could mean lots of different things, and it typically meant working on a variety of jobs throughout the countryside. But you can see there's all sorts of different things that the Chinese were doing, and these again were the only people that were actually counted. So presumably, you have to increase this by some sort of factor. So given all that and how big they were doing, so we can look at, well, why were they successful, right? Why were the Chinese, hired and employed in so many different industries in Napa? And first, we can look at the countryside and look at the rural thing. And let's look at the winery, right? The vineyards, the wine industry, because that's clearly, it was a growing industry then. Clearly, it's a big industry now. So the first reason is not unsurprising, it was cost, right? So a Chinese laborer would work in a vineyard for $1 a day, and the equivalent white laborer would require $1.50 a day for doing the job. So you're already, you know, 2/3 the cost. The white laborer would work for $1 a day if you provided room and board, but otherwise it was $1.50 a day. So clearly that was a big factor. And one of the other factors too is the Chinese workers had a reputation, well earned, of being actually quite reliable, and they would do what was told. You know, they were told, and so if they had to do the job, they agreed to do it, they would actually do the job. The white laborers at this time, there was a reputation of certainly a lot of transient white labor that would come through, and if they happened to hear of a gold or silver strike up in the mountains, they would drop their hoe or shovel in the middle of the field and just take off to try to strike it rich. So you could count on the Chinese laborers to do the work, which was good. And interesting, another surprising thing is if you look at this vineyard, the picture we have here, and you can think in your mind what the vineyards of Napa look like today, this looks a little different. The vineyards of Napa Valley, if you go up there today, there's these incredibly neat rows of vines there's a wire about 3 feet off the ground, and the stakes, and there's just kind of beautiful regular patterns that dot the hillsides and the valley floor. This vineyard doesn't look like that, right? Though at this point, the vines were allowed to go on the ground, kind of like berries, I suppose, and they were picked. And you can see the gentleman on the right who's stooping over to pick the grapes. And this was known as stoop labor, because they were stooping over. And white laborers hated stoop labor, considered it demeaning, and in a lot of cases wouldn't do it. The Chinese laborers, though, didn't have any sort of culture or other kind of prohibition against that, so they were kind of happy to get the work. So they were willing to do it, and it was good for the wine industry that they did. In addition to working on vineyards, they also did things in the wineries themselves, and specifically digging out wine caves, which were needed for the wines when they were fermenting and going from and transitioning to the wines that could be drunk. And we have some current wine caves still in use that were dug by Chinese laborers. These were pictures I took at Schramsberg Winery, which is very well known for their sparkling wines. It's between Calistoga and St. Helena, kind of in the hillside on the west part of the valley. And you can see that on the left there, obviously not the lights were not there, but that cave was actually dug out by Chinese wine, people working there. They had a lot of experience after working on the railroad, especially with dynamite and digging tunnels. And so this was a logical extension of a lot of their skills. But there was also a lot of backbreaking, shovel and pick work. And in fact, on the right picture there, you can see the pick marks. They're still there from when the Chinese dug out the caves, and those caves are still there. An interesting thing, I understand you guys have actually, there's some experience with this particular picture. This picture is a really interesting part of the story of the emergence of the wine industry in Napa and so on. In 1878, Harper's Weekly, a very famous monthly or weekly news magazine, or newspaper really, that was national, heard about the burgeoning Napa wine industry in Napa and Sonoma valleys. And what they did, they sent out a reporter and a sketch artist to talk to some of the vineyard owners and winery owners and understand what was going on. And they wrote a very complimentary piece about the wine industry in Sonoma and Napa. And it's really referred to as one of the seminal moments in getting Napa Valley wines, Sonoma Valley wines, kind of known on the national and worldwide stage, and really helped increase the popularity. But even at that time, the winery owners realized, that people probably wouldn't like, they had so many Chinese workers working there, but they really were not going to push that because they were worried about the reaction of having Chinese workers working on their wineries, because there's such an anti-Chinese sentiment, as we saw really nationwide and so on. But the sketch artist, though, drew this picture, which accompanied the article, and this is colorized. There's a black and white that actually showed up in the magazine itself. And if you can see which is kind of this action shot kind of wine being made. And if you look in the upper right of this picture here, you can see Chinese workers in their distinctive hats stomping on the grapes to make the wine. And this caused a huge uproar. So there was a lot of pushback, a lot of people saying, well, we don't want these Chinese workers introducing foreign diseases because they're stomping on grapes and so on. And to their credit, the winery owners refused to fire these Chinese workers. They said they are integral to our success. We can't make the wine at the prices that people are willing to pay without the Chinese laborers. They're good laborers. They're quite knowledgeable. They had quite a bit of expertise in everything it took to make wine, and so they did push back. So a couple ironic things came from this. This was in 1878, 1879. There was so much frustration from the anti-Chinese leagues that the anti-Chinese forces that the winery owners would not fire their Chinese workers, that they actually, that's one of the things that caused the article to be put in the 1880 Constitution, state constitution, saying that Chinese can't be employed by corporations. And the other thing actually is, this never actually happened. There were no Chinese stomping on grapes at this time. Back even in 1878, the wineries were a lot more sophisticated than this. They had wine presses that did this work. You did not have people stomping on grapes. This was just an artistic license that the sketch artist did to add a little color to their story. So again, I guess there's fake news even back then. But grapes were not the only kind of harvest or crop destined for alcoholic beverages that were in the Napa Valley. Hop yards, and hops, of course, go into beer, were also quite popular, and in fact, perhaps as big as wine as grapes in the early days. Unlike grapes, though, and wineries that were really up and down the valley, hop yards were only around St. Helena. And they were almost all destined for foreign ports, England in particular, because that's where most of the beer was made, or at least the beer that they needed the hops. And this is a sketch. We actually have a contemporaneous sketch of a hop field in St. Helena. And you can actually, if you can zoom in a little bit right there, you can see actually the Chinese workers working on the hop yards. Now, the hop fields, it has similar issues. You can see from the picture, the way it works is the hops actually go up a pole, like a 10-foot pole that are planted, and there's 1,500 poles per acre. So it's actually a fairly capital intensive crop to plant hops. And so again, much like the winery workers, the hop yard workers or hop yard owners were looking for the cheapest labor source they could find, and ended up being Chinese laborers. So while wineries actually had workers that were Chinese and some whites and some mixtures, hop yards, and there were 5 major hop yards around St. Helena, all were exclusively Chinese labor. In addition, there's mining. Now, there really was no gold or silver of any significance around Napa Valley, but there was quicksilver or mercury that was available in the kind of hillside, certainly around Mount St. Helena, and there were mining companies set up around there to mine the quicksilver. For mercury for thermometers and other needs, and of course mercury is toxic, and so this is like, and there were, the safety was non-existent, and so between the standard issues you had with digging mines in the earth and collapses and all that, you also had the miners that were breathing toxic mercury vapor. So it was a very unsafe thing, but the Chinese were very prevalent in the mines there. Now the mines were mostly segregated. There were mines that had Chinese miners, and the mines that had white workers. And there were a few mixes, but a lot of times the mines would get set up one way or the other. And we do know a fair bit about the Great Western Mine, which is on the foothills of Mount St. Helena, just kind of east of Calistoga. And all the miners were Chinese, and there were 2 camps that were set up, and they were impacted by the California Constitution. This passed in 1879, 1880, where the mine had to shut down for months because their laborers were not allowed to work. We have a picture then. This is the mine, the housing that the Chinese had to build for themselves where they lived, because they were too far away from town. They couldn't live in town or anything like that. So they had to live at the site, at the mine. There was no running water, no sewage facilities. They had to cook in little barbecues and fires, in front of their cabins. So it was definitely a kind of hard scrabble existence. We also have a picture of the entire staff, and it's a little hard to tell. It's a little grainy, of course, but you can kind of see pictures of dresses. There's women in dresses in the middle. These were the wives of some of the white supervisors and superintendents that worked in the mine. But then all around the center were all the Chinese workers that worked in the mine, and it was definitely an important source. It was the only way that the Great Western Mine could stay in business. Now, in towns, Chinese also had a lot of different jobs. Probably the most numerous one was kind of this cook or domestic servant. So this was a very common occupation in town. They were known as China boys, and they were all men, but they were all called China boys, no matter how old they were, and they were highly sought after and fairly inexpensive. And so it was a way for middle and upper class families throughout Napa Valley to have a little bit of luxury. And we do know of some. We know about Ah Hing. So Ah Hing was he was a cook and also practically a general manager for a household, the Lymans, who owned a small farm north of St. Helena, and he was with them from 1884 to 1919. So you can actually see we have an early picture and a later picture. So he started as a relatively young man and as a relatively old man, and served the Lyman household. And they had a couple of boys there, and we have the writings from one of the boys talking about Ah Hing and what he did. And he was effectively, as I said, like the general manager. He was responsible for not only cooking the meals, and apparently the Mrs. Lyman was from the South, and so he ended up having to learn how to cook with a lot of gravy and things like that, which he did. But he also was responsible for making sure that boys got their homework done. He would supervise if there were other Chinese laborers that would come in to work on the vegetable garden and so on. He would supervise them. He really, he would serve at the dinner. So he kept the whole household going. And the son writes that occasionally Ah Hing would go back to China, occasionally visit his family throughout his tenure, and they would have a substitute come in. And the boys talked about how great it was when the substitute came in, because they were always a lot less harsh on them than Ah Hing was. So I guess Ah Hing ran a pretty tight ship. But he eventually went back. He had vision problems, and in 1919, probably one of the last Chinese living in Napa Valley, he went back to China, or when his vision became too bad. Another interesting part was the Sawyer Tannery. So actually, in this time frame, in late 1870s, Napa was really known more for leather goods than for wine or anything else. And in fact, today even there's this thing called Napa leather, either NAPA or NAPPA leather, which is a very soft leather. And it's done using a process that was trademarked in the Sawyer Tannery in Napa, and it's still used today. A lot of luxury cars, especially European cars, will have Napa leather in their seats. And they were founded in the mid 1870s, and by 1878, they were founded with like 4 Chinese laborers and 1 white laborer. And 80% of the workforce by 1878 was Chinese, and it helped really grow the Sawyer Tannery, which, as you can see the picture on the right here, was on the Napa River. Really became a very large enterprise. They had a dedicated dormitory for all the Chinese workers to live that were working there. So a very big enterprise, and they were one of the first businesses in Napa to employ large-scale numbers of Chinese, in addition to the railroad. Now, they have the dubious distinction also of when in 1886 we had the initial rise of the anti-Chinese groups in Napa. They were almost immediately fired all their Chinese workers. So they, unfortunately, while they were relatively progressive at the beginning, they did not show themselves very well, because they fired all the Chinese workers who were really instrumental in their initial growth. Another thing was laundries. So it's a bit of a trope, but it's true that the Chinese dominated the laundry industry. And laundries, of course, if we take ourselves back 150 years, there weren't washing machines and dryers, right? So if the household was well off at all, they would pay for somebody else to do their laundry. And the Chinese dominated. They had laundromats in China, or laundries in Chinatown and kind of throughout town. And this incensed the local business establishment. They hated the fact that Chinese dominated and were the laundry owners of choice. And you would see these ads, like in the Napa Valley Register on the far left there, where there's an ad for a white laundry. Now, that's not saying we will get your clothes white. This is saying we only employ white laborers, right? And we do this without the need for Chinese labor. And you'd see these ads, and these laundries would rise up, and then they would eventually fall away. And in fact, this article to the right next to it was in the same issue that this ad was in, that basically that Napa White Laundry folded because it could not compete with the Chinese laundries. So it was interesting that they could not compete with both the price, the cost, and just the level of service they were getting. And the laundries, Sam Key is a very famous, this laundry was actually started during this period in the late 1800s, it lasted to 1974 and so, and it moved several times. This is a picture of the Sam Key Laundry in downtown Napa in the 60s, I believe this picture is. So he and his family were pretty successful. Now Sam Key, the city fathers or the city council, not only certainly hated the presence of these Chinese laundries, and so they actually passed a law, an ordinance banning Chinese-owned laundries, and Sam Key was arrested, and 4 or 5 of his workers were arrested on this charge that they were illegally operating a laundry because it was a public nuisance, is what the law said. So Sam Key actually got out on bail. And the next day, he hired attorney Riordan out of San Francisco, and they fought the ordinance in the California Supreme Court, and they won. And they actually got the Napa ordinance declared illegal, that you couldn't ban Chinese-owned laundries. And that ordinance, or that the case, was cited over 20 times in cases throughout the country against ordinances banning Chinese laundries. So it was very had far-reaching effects in Napa and throughout the country. And then finally, another one I just want to talk about is China stores. So we did talk about the Chinese laborers were not allowed to immigrate after 1882, but there's a different class of immigrant, the merchant class. And so the merchants, every Chinatown in every area had a China store run by Chinese merchants, and they had a little different status. They were allowed to immigrate with their families. Laborers were not. And, they had to show certain capital requirements and so on. They could also go back and forth more easily than to China than laborers. And the China stores, we have quite a few ads in the local newspapers put out by these Chinese merchants advertising their wares. And this is a picture of the La Hing store in Napa's Chinatown. And it served as a kind of a pharmacy, apothecary, a grocery store, an herb store, but also post office, employment office, gathering place. These China stores are really the hubs of kind of Chinese culture in these different towns up and down Napa Valley. And it's interesting. We do have that. So they were very, very important. The merchants themselves had a very kind of high status in towns. So they had really, by the mid 1880s, quite a few, successes legally. As I mentioned, they were able to push back against the Chinese, the anti-laundry ordinance. And in fact, I mentioned that the Great Western Mine had to shut down for a few months because of the California Constitution. Well, there's another mine, the Great Silver Springs Mine in St. Helena, that was also shut down because of the California Constitution. They couldn't employ their Chinese laborers. And so, but they also took that to the state Supreme Court, and they got that overturned. And in fact, it got declared Article 19 unconstitutional in the Chinese Constitution because of quicksilver mine in the Napa Valley. And so again, the entire state was actually a little better off because of some legal action that the Napa Valley mine took. And so that was successful. They actually were relatively successful in the legal area, certainly dealing with constitutional law. The Chinese did a good job kind of fighting against some of the most egregious laws passed against them. Economically, their power really peaked around 1887 or so. If we think about the Chinese Exclusion Act was in 1882, so it didn't kick any of the laborers out, but it stopped any laborers from coming in. And so what you had then is you had demand continue to grow because of the growth of the vineyards and the overall population and the mines and all this other stuff. So the demand for labor continued to grow, but the supply was relatively constricted because there weren't any other Chinese laborers coming in. And so the vineyard workers actually went on strike, and they got a raise. It was $1.25 at that point in 1886, and they got a raise to $1.50. The hop workers saw how successful the vineyard workers were, and they went on strike and got a raise from $1 a day to $1.25 a day. So they actually kind of realized their economic power and their leverage in this, and they took advantage of it. So interestingly, one of the reasons they were hired because the vineyard owners thought they were so docile, but in fact they actually kind of saw their power and they took advantage of it, which was really which was quite inspiring. So economically, they're doing fairly well. They were involved in lots of different areas throughout the Napa Valley, and they also had tried to keep their culture together while they were here. And they did this quite a few different ways. We do have some, direct evidence. They would Chinese New Year. It's a big deal now. It's a big deal back then as a celebration. And so we would see ads posted by a lot of the Chinese merchants in the newspapers, kind of as a way to engage the broader community. So here we have Ginger, who was the kind of main China store merchant owner in St. Helena, and he advertised that firecrackers will be burned Sunday afternoon next, about 3 or 4 o'clock, in front of my store in Chinatown, St. Helena. The public generally are invited to be present, and this is a big deal because white townspeople did not frequent St. Helena's Chinatown very often. So this is kind of a big deal to try to get the businesses to the population to come in. Chinatowns, so Napa, St. Helena, Calistoga all had Chinatowns. Napa's Chinatown, there was a relatively good experience and good relationship with the white residents. St. Helena's not so much. Calistoga is a little smaller. But they all had their own Chinatowns where Chinese lived and where we had a lot of Chinese businesses. And Chinese also, would have their recreation when they were not working in the fields. We also, another big thing, of course, was, in addition to working, was death. And the Chinese that came over to work never intended to die here. They were almost everybody intended to come over, work for a while, raise some money, send it back to their families, then go back to China with their families. But not all of them were able to do that for various reasons. And we actually have some evidence there. On the left, there's a picture from Tulake Cemetery in Napa. It's still an active, it is the city cemetery. It's still there. And we have 7 tombstones that we are still present. I have a picture of 2 of them right there with Chinese writing, which actually have the merchants that were kind of in the upper kind of at least upper middle class in the Chinese society, and we're able to get the pay for stone tombstones. So we have their information. This entire area, which is called the county section in Tulake, was filled with graves from Chinese that were buried there, but they were all wooden tombstones, and they burned down or disintegrated over time. So they don't even know how many people are buried in this area. And so the entire area, there's no burials allowed in this area because there's so many unmarked graves. But we do have the 7 tombstones that we do know about them there. On the right is actually a picture from St. Helena's public cemetery. Now, they had just little tiny markers. They did not have giant tombstones for the Chinese workers, just little markers. And unfortunately, in 1930, after really most of the Chinese had gone, a flood came down the creek that runs right behind the cemetery and washed away about half of the graves in the cemetery. And so they don't know who's in there. They have a record of all the people that are buried there, but they have no idea who's still there and who's not. So that was certainly something that was unfortunate. But at least we do have some evidence of their existence and their religion, of course, is a very big deal to the Chinese that were here. They were all Taoist, and they worshiped in a temple, which was called a joss house. Was the white residents talked about at the time, but it was a temple. And when your Chinatown area got a temple, you kind of knew it had made it. I mean, there were enough people there, and it was a significant enough presence to get a temple. And both Napa's and St. Helena's Chinatowns had temples. They were constructed by the Chinese Freemasons. So the Freemasons, interestingly, was a fraternal organization made up of Chinese that you'd pay dues and you would help for members of the group. You'd have to have good moral character and so on, and you had to you had to agree to support your other Masons. Now these, even though it's the same name, are not the same Masons that's the Masonic organization today. This was an organization, it was an anti-emperor organization, kind of this underground organization that didn't like the emperor in China. And when they immigrated from China to the United States, the organization kind of immigrated along with them, and they would still meet in like San Francisco, and there'd be these closed sessions where you'd have the Chinese meet, and the local San Francisco merchants got a little worried about this, and so the newspapers sent a couple reporters down to kind of spy on these meetings, And it turned out they were just talking about the emperor of China and trying to how they're going to overthrow the emperor. And so the reporters came back and reported back that these, it's nothing nefarious. It's dealing with foreign entanglements. We don't really care about that. They're just like the Freemasons, right? Just as and so the Chinese themselves liked that association. Hey, we're like the organization of Ben Franklin and George Washington and Dan Brown or whatever. And so they took that name. And so they basically served a very similar purpose to the kind of Masonic organizations that were very popular, of course, still are today, but certainly very popular in the 1800s. They would raise money and they would build these temples. And while we don't have the temple anymore, the altar that was in Napa's Chinatown was rescued before it was destroyed and is currently owned and goes on exhibit periodically at the Chinese Historical Society of America Museum in San Francisco on Clay Street. We do have some pictures. We don't have many pictures. We have a few. This is a sketch in 1927 of the Chinatown in Napa, right along the Napa River, right before it was destroyed. It was leveled to make a yacht harbor, which was never built, but it was leveled at that point. But you can see the stilts there, so it was right along the river and flooded occasionally. We do have a picture here. We do have a picture of, this is in Napa's Chinatown. The man in the back is Chanhua Jack, who was the main China merchant in town. And this is his family. The merchants were allowed to bring their families over. This is his family. They were in front of the temple during a New Year's parade. And so we kind of know then the kids were dressed in their finery, as you can see. So we do have that. We don't have a picture of Calistoga's Chinatown. We do have, though, if you ever go to the Sharpstein Museum, they have this giant diorama of what Calistoga looked like in the late 1800s. It's really quite fascinating. They have a separate diorama that actually has a model of Chinatown. And from the maps we have of that time, this is a fairly accurate representation of what Chinatown looked like. So relatively small, but it was both housing, lodging, and businesses that were there. But you can see it was literally on the wrong side of the tracks, right? This is actually just down the end of Lincoln Avenue, which is if you ever go up Valley at Calistoga, there's like the one stoplight they hang a right on, and you just go down to the end there, and the depot is still there, the railroad tracks are still there. Chinatown is not there, but a lot of the Chinese in Calistoga worked on the railroad, and so I'm sure it was very noisy, but that's where they lived. In St. Helena, we have this picture. We have a photograph of a portion of Chinatown in St. Helena. And so as you can see, it's kind of 2 stories structure. This is located on land. Chinese were not allowed to own land, and if they were allowed to own, no self-respecting white landowner would sell to them. And so they leased this land. All this land was owned by a man named John Gillum, and is where currently today, if you go up Valley, you see Gott's Roadside Cafe or Roadside kind of diner. That's where Chinatown was. So it's on the southern part of St. Helena, kind of as you come into town. Now, St. Helena's Chinatown is interesting because I mentioned Napa's relationship with Chinatown was fairly benign. There were a lot of townspeople that would shop in Chinatown to get certain Chinese herbs and interesting artifacts. But in St. Helena, the townspeople hated their Chinatown. And there's several reasons, primarily in addition to the overall anti-Chinese sentiment that was pervasive. This was on as I mentioned, the southern part of town. And so as you're going up Valley, like either along the railroad or on stagecoach or on horseback, this Chinatown was the first thing you saw. And the laborers were not here with their families. So there was a bunch of men living together, single men or married men with other families living together. So that, as you can imagine, it's a little bit, it was not the neatest place. There was open sewers. There was kind of slaughtering that was going on. Apparently there was the big odor that came out of from Chinatown. So the town, the leading kind of citizens of town hated Chinatown and kept trying to get John Gillum, who owned Chinatown, the land, to get rid of them, to evict all the Chinese. And John Gillum said, well, I'd love to evict them, but this is a large portion of my net worth, and I can't just, these are all, you're paying rent to live here. I can't just get rid of them. And so a group of anti-Chinese leaders bought Chinatown area in 1886, and they told the Chinese, you have to leave. And there's this article right there in the local St. Helena Star newspaper, very extolling the virtue. Great, Chinatown sold, they have to leave. Well, the Chinese, they had these leases from John Gillum that either had expiration dates in the future or no expiration date, and they fought these Chinese leaders in court and challenged their right to evict them. And so for the next 20 years, some Chinese were actually keep fighting against the eviction notice. And during that time, they never paid rent. And so we had this kind of a bit of a, they were, I think the Chinese people who lived there actually got the better of the deal at the very end. But despite their overall economic success and so on, they really were eventually forgotten, eventually driven out. And as I mentioned, there's kind of this rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, and you can see it even in just a few articles that just from the mid 1870s to the mid 1880s, where the articles would start with like, oh, well, what's the deal with all these Chinese in our midst, and what are we going to do about that? All the way to the Chinese must go, they're taking our jobs. They got very, being kind of concerned to very vitriolic, this economic argument of they're taking jobs from the white people who wanted them, when in fact, though, there were many more jobs than were being done at all. So if the Chinese weren't there, then there would be no wine industry or whatever, but that was the argument. But there was a parallel argument on the kind of morality side about, because the Chinese, the peasants that were here, the Chinatowns, certainly can contain businesses where you could buy food, but they also contain opium dens and gambling halls, because gambling was a pastime of Chinese farmers and peasants. That's what they want to do in their spare time. And opium dens is where they smoke opium, was a kind of a recreational drug, much like bars and saloons were for the white Europeans. And similarly, and they were and the white townspeople were frequently found in the opium dens and the gambling halls. And so there was quite a few laws, local ordinances that were passed by both St. Helena and Napa city leaders, making outlawing opium dens and outlawing gambling houses. And you'd frequently have these raids by the sheriffs to go in there and arrest the owners and anybody who was participating in frequenting these establishments. But they would only arrest the Chinese people, and they would leave the white people there. And even the Napa Valley Register, which was a very anti-Chinese newspaper, eventually ran an editorial saying, what are you doing? If you're going to have a law, you have to apply it to everybody equally. You can't just arrest the people you want to arrest, because it turned out there was a demand. But as I mentioned, by 1900 or so, most of the Chinese in Napa Valley are gone. And they're gone for several reasons. The biggest one is demographics. So I mentioned we had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which stopped the flow of laborers, but everybody that was here working could still work. And because the law took a few years to pass, there was this giant rush of additional immigration in 1881, 1882. But regardless, over the next 18 years, these young men that came over to work got older, and they would either pass away or got injured or couldn't do the backbreaking physical work that was there. So they eventually left. Plus, as I mentioned, almost all of these were men, either single men or married men here without their families. And they would, and so there was no second generation to take over their, to be the next generation of laborers. And so you've had this notion of just this contraction of there were just no more Chinese people left, because as they get older, they couldn't do the farming work. So they would either go back, they might go back to China or do other things. And at the same time, you start having replacement workers come in, primarily the Italians. So the Italians came in the 1880s, and they were certainly, I think, on the pecking order of desirable European immigrants. Italians were pretty much at the bottom, but so they end up doing kind of some of the jobs that nobody else wanted to do, which was similar to the jobs the Chinese were doing. But they were different because, unlike the Chinese, they were allowed to own property and own their own businesses. And so what happened was, and a lot of the Italians had done winemaking in Italy. And so when they came over, they were able to take over some of the wineries in Napa, because by this time you started getting the initial kind of inklings of prohibition. And so the demand for wine started to go down because of that. And there was this economic depression that also kind of was affecting things. So they were able to come in and purchase some of the wineries at really rock bottom prices, and they were able to kind of use their family as workers. So they are owner operators, and so they were able to do things in a little more efficient manner than the prior separated way that it worked. In addition, at this time, phylloxera, which of course decimated France's vineyards in the 1870s came over and was starting to really hit the Napa Valley vineyards pretty hard in the 1880s, 1890s. And so they had to replant the vines with a more phylloxera-resistant strain. And when they replanted it, they made the vines further apart in straight rows, and they put them up on the wires so that the mechanical, you can use more mechanized harvesting machines instead of just manual labor. And so you didn't need as much labor there, and that's why the vineyards look like they do today. And you didn't need stoop labor if you had any more. So it kind of worked out all right. But what you get now is you get like this was a website, the Visit Napa Valley website that was in the just like last year, and it talks about he went a trip to Napa Valley and talks about California's wine country has deep Italian roots. One can only imagine the pleasure with Italian immigrants first discovered this region in mid-19th century and so on. And it's true that the Italians did kind of save the wine industry, but of course, this is what I mentioned, that a lot of the wineries that they saved were really built using Chinese labor, right? Which is completely unacknowledged. That is really it's not to really take away from what the Italians did, but it really shows that the Chinese were there first and just didn't have the opportunity on multiple levels to really be as successful as they could. But so that's the story. That's kind of the arc of the Chinese in the Napa Valley. I will say that we've actually had some fairly good news at the end this year. When the book came out in January, we did get some other community members going, and we are in the process of getting an educational sign. It's just a mock-up, but an educational sign posted overlooking Napa River, where Chinatown used to be. And so we're going to be able, because, Napa is a tourist destination of some renown. So we're hoping this will also help communicate what's going on and educate people that come and they can see where Chinatown was. Because right now there's a very small marker on a bridge, but it's not very done, and that doesn't really explain much of some of the history. We also got a grant from the city of St. Helena, and we are getting a monument placed in the public cemetery in St. Helena with the names of all the fairly high, like a marble monument about 4 or 5 feet tall, with all the names of all the Chinese that were buried in St. Helena. So it's very exciting. We're actually starting to get some, recognition of what's going on in the city and on the cities of Napa and St. Helena and Calistoga. So that's it's very exciting. It's a nice way. That is the goal of the book, and the goal of telling the story is really an American success story. So Dan, that's what I have. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take some of them.
Of course, we have questions. Thank you, John. That was a terrific story, well told. Congratulations on the sign, and that's not just from me. A couple of our viewers have also talked about, congratulating you on the sign and the marker. So good stuff. Couple things that came up. This one in particular, you and I had some experience with, I think. Somebody asked about the idea of the primary source material, letters, diaries, and things like that would help the Chinese laborers tell their own story. Can you kind of talk about why you and I had such great problems with this idea?
It is a problem, right? Because we don't have, as I mentioned, we don't have any diaries necessarily of Chinese that worked there. In the book, though, I did find it was quite interesting, an oral history written by a man named Jack Ju, who is he's a physician, retired physician out of Sacramento. His great grandfather Ju Zhou was one of the was a worker in St. Helena in the vineyards, and he had documented a bunch of oral history from his family, both him and his aunt who lives in Walnut Creek. Documented this, had this website kind of documenting the history of Ju Zhou, who's a fascinating man in his own right. And so we were able to kind of take some of that, and I kind of weave his story a little bit throughout the book to give it a little more of a personal touch. And Jack and I did a joint presentation in Napa earlier this year, and so we're stuck with that. We don't have any. We have no written records firsthand. So we are kind of limited to a little bit of these kind of family histories that went through. But it is consistent. It does consistent story. I had kind of hoped that as doing these kind of presentations, we'd get a little more of the descendants that come forward. And I have the a great niece of Chanwa Jack, who was in that picture that we saw in Napa. I did meet her in San Francisco at the Chinatown exhibit. So she's actually going to be there at the unveiling of the sign. So that's exciting, but that's all so far.
Yeah, it's funny because we had sort of the same wish. Typically, when you do an exhibit, things come in from the community saying, "Oh, I've got something too." We got nothing out of that as far as any kind of letter, diary, personal information. It's very curious.
I think one of the challenges we have, other than the merchant class, this entire generation that came in the 1870s to 1880s effectively died out, and then we had subsequent generations of immigrants, which are the families mostly that are kind of around here today. And so we have this kind of break. Unfortunately, we don't have as much continuity as we would like.
So I'm going to combine a couple here. You have a picture actually on the sign and in your program of I think his name was Chanwa Jack, with his family all duded up for the holiday. And the question really was, were there families here? Were there wives, children? Did the children go to school? If so, where? Can you talk about the domestic information a little bit?
It's really fascinating. So the one of the interesting, we talk a lot about the 1882, at least in like immigration history, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act is a really notorious act. What's not talked about as much is there was one in 1875 called the Page Act, and it effectively it was basically kind of intended to prevent prostitutes from coming to the United States, but effectively banned Chinese women from coming to the United States and made it illegal. It was so onerous for a Chinese woman to come that they effectively didn't. And the strategy of the U.S., it was really the U.S. Immigration Service policy or strategy, was we don't want we realize we need the Chinese to come in and work, but we don't want them settling here. We don't want Chinese people living here. And so if we only bring the men in, they will work for a while, then they'll go home and they won't bring their families. And so laborers did not bring, there were just the ratio of men to women was this crazy high number because there just weren't that many women around. Merchants were allowed to bring their families over. They were in a different class, which is why we have Chanwa Jack's family. And in fact, of those children are there in that picture, one of them was the first Asian lawyer ever gotten the bar in California. We had another one who ended up marrying a Chinese princess and came out. I mean, his family was incredibly successful and dynamic, but most did not. The children that were here, and there were a few, they were not allowed to go to public schools until the mid 1880s, and so they would either be taught at home, or some of the churches would actually teach them as a way to kind of convert them to Christianity, but they would teach them. And so some of the churches took that, but then the 1890s or so, they were integrated into the public schools and were taught there.
So one of the great myths against the Chinese was that they were taking people's jobs.
Right.
Was there competition between you talked about when the Italians started to move in, fulfilling some of those roles. Was there any kind of Mexican population that had moved in at the same time?
It doesn't seem like it. It seemed like the competition, but it was true. I mean, so in some ways, some of these things have a germ of truth. I mean, there was a lot of resentment, I think, because the Chinese would work for cheaper labor. There were a lot more jobs than could be filled, but there is a story, and there's some articles where there was a road construction crew going up. I think it was Silver Isle Trail is now, a bunch of white laborers who went on strike for lower wages or higher wages, and the owner fired all them and hired Chinese laborers to do the work. And eventually the white laborers came back at the lower wage. So, I mean, I think economic anxiety and so on. I mean, so there is some truth to it, but no, I think really during this period, 1870 to 1900, Chinese had a real stranglehold, better for worse, on this kind of lower tier labor ladder. I think because they would be willing to work for less. I think we just really can't underestimate how much they were known as kind of this compliant, reliable workforce. And this is like, this isn't much beyond the Wild West, right? I mean, 1870s is still pretty. And so I think the fact they were reliable workers was just an enormous incentive for a lot of these large business owners.
Yeah, almost the same experience on the Transcontinental Railroad,
Exactly,
with
similar
which
thing.
they became much more reliable labor source than anybody else.
Yeah.
Um, the phrase Chinese league popped up several times. Can you describe what a Chinese league is?
I've not heard that. I don't know about that. The one group we do have is the Chinese six companies, which is relative, which was pretty, which is prominent today even. And that they used a lot they would actually help a lot of the immigrants come in and settle and find jobs for them. And so that may be where it is. They're tongs, so factions, but we didn't really hear of any of those in Napa Valley themselves. The two organizations that we hear about most reliably are the Chinese Freemasons and the Chinese six companies. Those were the two that got together that would help with employment. They would help with getting people back there. The Chinese, the six companies, we even help. As I mentioned, people would be dead and buried in graves, and if you could all afford it, the Chinese six company would help disinter your body and take it back to your village. And so we do know, like in St. Helena, I think we had 61, I want to say, people buried there, and we know of 17 that were disinterred and shipped back to China. So there were a lot that helpful there. Chinese League maybe, but I'm not familiar. I did not run across that.
Again, it's sort of a common experience, was the recognition of the use of the Chinese, of the legal system by the Chinese. Their willingness to go on strikes, to represent themselves for better wages. I remember when we were doing the Transcontinental, they insisted upon having a contract which allowed them their own cooks and their own fresh food coming from San Francisco. Can you talk about when the legal system and how the Chinese managed to, as you said, they were known to be docile group, but
No, they were but they were very.
they
I
represent
would
themselves
agree.
pretty well.
They did take advantage of the legal system very successfully in a couple of different instances, and there's some other ones where they did a good job. I mean, constitutional. We today we're like inundated with all sorts of legal constitutional things, but they did a good job, I think, using the legal system to push back against for their constitutional rights, and they were actually quite successful. The Chinese six companies was a fairly powerful organization out of San Francisco, and would typically represent Chinese people everywhere, but certainly in the Napa Valley to help push back against some of these ordinances. They were not nearly as successful in the legal system in criminal law, and so there are multiple instances, and I have a chapter in my book on unequal before the law, where they would be, if they were victims of crime, there would be, if the cops would investigate, but if they couldn't catch the perpetrator right then, they basically didn't care. If a Chinese person committed a crime, and I have several instances of this, and it's really fascinating, for the exact same crime, the Chinese person would have 10 times the punishment. I mean, it was just almost comical. So they did not fare particularly well. And there's also we have instances of they were at this end of this period in the 1880s, 1890s, allowed to testify, which they weren't initially. They were allowed to testify, but they weren't allowed to serve on juries. And it was still okay for a attorney to say, you should just disregard what you hear from the Chinese person testifying to the jury. So so constitutional law, quite strong. Criminal law, not horribly disadvantaged.
Yeah, that sounds it. You mentioned a book. Where can we find the book?
Oh, yes, the book is called Chinese Napa Valley. It's it's in Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's in some local bookstores around. I don't know how many around there, but certainly around here in Lafayette, and in Napa, it's in almost all the bookstores. There. So if you want to read it, it's great. It's, it tells the story in a little more complete way, but it's not very long. It's a quick read, and I've gotten some good reviews on it, which is exciting.
Well, I've had a lot of fun with this morning, John. So thanks for coming on, and I'd like to thank everybody for viewing this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, you can find them by going to the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will appear early next week. Join us on Thursday, September 21st at 11:30 for BART, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. This program will be hosted by Michael Healy, retired head of public affairs for BART, aka Bay Area Rapid Transit. Michael will explore the rich history, current advances, and the future of this iconic Bay Area transit system. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. We also have need of volunteers at the museum. If you can give us some time, please contact us. Hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Again, thank you, John.
You bet.
Stay safe, and thank you for watching.